Using a 19mm socket, let's go ahead and remove our lug nuts. Remove the wheel and set it aside. Now with the key turn to the on position, that allows us to go ahead and manually turn our wheels like so. I'm going to go ahead and use our 12mm socket and remove our brake caliper bolts. Good, spin out the bolts and we'll set those aside. We're going to use a small pry bar. We're going to get it up underneath the caliper and our bracket and just kind of work this off. Once we have our caliper removed, we're going to use our hanger here to go ahead and support the caliper up and out of the way. Let's go ahead and remove our brake pads. Now our brake pads are pretty much frozen in our brake caliper bracket. Just going to use our pry bar and tap the brake pad backing plate, try and work these out. Using a 17mm socket, we're going to go ahead and remove our brake caliper bracket bolts. You want to hold that bracket. As soon as you remove this bolt, it's going to be loose. You don't want it to drop on your foot. Good, pull that off and set it aside. With the caliper and bracket removed, go ahead and you can manually straighten out that wheel. Now on our particular rotor, we have a Phillips head screw here and one here. This is not a structural component, so if yours does not have these two screws or one screw, it is not detrimental to the operation here. We're going to use our impact driver. I'm going to go ahead and loosen this here. Now with both of these loose, go ahead and spin those out with your screwdriver. Go ahead and set those aside. Go ahead and grab your brake rotor. Set that aside. Using a 12mm socket, go ahead and remove our flex line bolt for the bracket. Remove that bolt and set it aside. Using a 10mm socket, go ahead and remove our ABS brake line bracket bolt here. Our ABS line right here has a little rubber grommet to anchor it onto this bracket. Just gonna go ahead and work that loose. That allows us for full mobility here. Grab your outer tie rod and your hub. Go ahead and rotate. It's gonna give us access to our tie rod nut. We're gonna use a 19mm socket. We're gonna remove that nut on our tie rod here. Pull it off, set it aside. There's two 10mm bolts for our ABS right here where it goes into the back of our wheel hub. We're gonna remove these two 10mm bolts. Let's go ahead and get our lower bolt here. Now with both of those bolts loose, we can go ahead and spin those out. Next, you want to go ahead and remove your ABS sensor from the back of the knuckle. We're going to use a little bit of rust penetrant, a little spray lube here to go ahead and seep in there. We use our pick around the edge just to clean up any of the scaly rust around the edge. This should help us remove this sensor. So we sprayed quite a bit of spray lube in here. We're using our pliers. You want to be super careful of this here. I'm going to gently grab the sensor and jiggle it back and forth. And you want to go ahead and inspect this sensor. Make sure there's no cracks, any wear marks, anything odd on here. Give it a good wipe down. I'm going to go ahead and set that to the side. Using a pair of cutters or pliers, bend out the tab on your lower ball joint. Straighten out that tab. Grab the head of it. Using the nut as leverage, go ahead and work that out. Using a 19mm socket, remove your lower ball joint nut. On our upper knuckle or control arm ball joint, I want to go ahead and use a pair of pliers. I'm going to remove this upper cotter pin. So we're going to bend the tabs out here. I want to go ahead and see if we can grab the top here. Using a 17mm socket, I want to go ahead and remove our upper nut here. All right, now that we're able to get that nut off, we're just going to thread it on just a couple threads. Using a 36mm socket, go ahead and remove your axle nut. And we're going to use a hammer. We're going to strike our knuckle. That's going to release our upper control arm ball joint. You can see that that nut is keeping that from popping out completely. That's exactly what we want. Now what we want to do is we're going to use a hammer. We're going to strike our knuckle here to release our lower ball joint. I'm going to use a pry bar. I'm going to apply a little bit of upward pressure on this here to help this pop. All right, that is now free. Go ahead and compress our upper control arm. We're going to remove this nut. Set that nut aside. Now as you bring this forward, we want to go ahead and start pushing in on our CV axle. We want to separate that axle from our bearing. Now we want to go ahead and lift up. And work that axle out. Go ahead and remove that knuckle with all the bearing equipment. Now on the back side of our knuckle, we have this trim ring right here. Now it is positioned or clocked in a particular way. 2/3 of this ring have this flange facing outward. The bottom third, right where the lower ball joint is, it is rolled inward. So upon reinstallation, we want to make sure that we have this clocked in the correct position. In order to access the underside of this here, you're going to look underneath. We're going to use a chisel tip, and we want to carefully work between the flange and the knuckle. We want to go ahead and remove, like continue our way around and lift this ring off of the knuckle itself. I'm going to use some solvent and spray this down. We're going to use our hub puller tool to go ahead and pull the hub out of the knuckle. So when we pressed out our wheel hub, the outer part of our bearing race had pulled out of our bearing itself, which is totally fine because we're going to be replacing the hub and the bearing. The next part we want to do is we're going to use a pick and clean up around the perimeter here because there is a lock ring in here we need to remove before we press the bearing out of the knuckle. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a chisel and I'm going to hit this side and I'm going to work on this side here back and forth. We want to go ahead and break this lock ring free from the rust. Now we're going to use our snap ring pliers. We're going to go ahead and open this up. I'm going to get underneath the edge right here because this side of our snap ring is rusted in place and it's very, very hard for me to get it out. So if I can work one side up, I can work the ring out the rest of the way around. And there we have it. I want to go ahead and push our bearing out of the knuckle. So before we install our new wheel bearing, you want to pay attention to the two sides of the bearing. One side is a chrome side, the other side has like a blackish trim around here, and this is where the magnet is for your ABS. You don't want to touch this with a screwdriver or any other pieces of metal. You do want to make sure when you put this in that the magnetic side goes in first. We're going to use our old bearing. We're going to set this on the top to line that up. We're going to use that to push that in. Put our block in here. And when you're pressing this in, you want to keep an eye on it. Make sure that that bearing is pressed in straight. You don't want that going in crooked. So we switched over to a solid block here between the press and a bearing. I'm going to go ahead and work that in. I'm going to switch this out because the bearing itself will fit down inside of our knuckle here. I'll line this up and continue to press that in. There it is, the bearing is bottomed out. So we went ahead and we cleaned up our snap ring here. I'm going to go ahead and use our snap ring pliers, drop this down into place. I'm just going to go ahead and tap this down. Just want to make sure that snap ring is in place. Ours is good. Just want to go ahead and install our wheel hub. Let's go ahead and set our knuckle back up into the press, and we'll go ahead and press this down into our bearing. Let's go ahead and get that started. Okay, our hub is now seated. On the back side of our knuckle here, we have our spot right here. There's a hole for where your ABS sensor is going to poke through and pick up the rotation on our ABS here. So when installing our trim ring here, you want to make sure that the bottom side, the flange facing down, is down facing the ball joint. And that this tab right here, this raised spot right here, lines up with where the sensor is going to come through. So I'm going to drop this down in a position. Line that up. And we're just going to go ahead and tap this down into place. Now it's all set into place and flush. Let's go ahead and install our knuckle. Now at this point here, once we have our flange sitting flush all the way around, let's go ahead and install our knuckle. What we're going to do is bring our knuckle up here, and we're going to line this up, line up our ball joint with the lower control arm, bring our CV axle up and in. All right, now that our ball joint is nestled into our lower control arm and our axle is coming through, let's go ahead and bring our upper control arm down. Let's get this upper nut started. Let's go ahead and get our axle nut threaded on. Let's go ahead and tighten down our upper ball joint nut here. Let's go ahead and torque this down to 35 foot-pounds. Let's go ahead and get our cotter pin in. Now that we have our cotter pin in, I'm going to go ahead and bend over the lower portion of this here. And we'll cut off the excess. Let's go ahead and install our lower ball joint nut. Let's go ahead and torque the lower ball joint nut to 60 foot-pounds. Let's go ahead and install our cotter pin. Go ahead, bend that over. And cut off the excess. Let's go ahead and install our outer tie rod. Get that nut put on there. I'm going to go ahead and get that snug down. Let's go ahead and torque our outer tie rod nut to 40 foot-pounds. I want to go ahead and line up our ABS sensor. We're going to feed that down inside. I'm going to get one of our bolts started here. Get that threaded in. Let's get our bracket installed up top here. Pop that into place and get one of our bolts started for that. Install our bracket here, line that up. Get the bolt started. Let's go ahead and snug all three of these down now. Just want to snug it into place. And just bottom that out. There we go. And we have the last part of our ABS wire right here. Can line that up and push that onto its bracket, and it pops into place. Let's now install our bracket for our brake flex hose here. And get our bolt started here. Let's go ahead and snug that down into position. Once that bolt bottoms out, just snug it down a little bit. Let's install 2 lug nuts. We're going to use our pry bar between these 2 protected studs. I'm going to go ahead and torque down our axle nut to 242 foot-pounds. Now we're going to go ahead and use a punch, and we're going to dimple the axle nut. This is going to work as a lock to keep this nut from loosening. Now, installing your brake rotor, you want to make sure that the recessed hole here lines up with our threaded ports here if you have your installation screws. Go ahead and line that up. Get that started. I'm going to do the same for the other. Now, if you don't have these screws, it is not critical to the operation. These are simply retainer screws to hold the rotor onto the hub while you're installing your brakes. Your brakes will work just fine if you do not have these. And we install our upper bolt for our bracket. Once we get that bolt caught through threads, we're going to go ahead and do the same for the bottom. Once those are in, we're going to go ahead and snug those down. Torque down our caliper bracket bolts to 80 foot-pounds. Let's go ahead and bring our brake caliper over. What we want to do next is we want to compress our piston into the caliper itself. Before we do this, we're going to come to this side here. There is a brake bleeder screw here. Ours has a little rubber boot on here. We're going to go ahead and pop that boot off. Yours may not have that. It's not that big of a deal, but it is good because it does protect the bleeder itself. We're going to use a 10mm socket. I'm going to go ahead and loosen this here. Now, our particular bleeder screw snapped off. What is supposed to happen is this bleeder screw opens up a few threads. This allows for some brake fluid to start to come out. Once that brake fluid starts to come out, you're going to have a catch can or some rags underneath to catch that fluid. Your next step is to use a compressor here, and we're going to install an original pad here. Install our compressor tool, and what we're going to do is this will work this piston back into the caliper. As this does this here, normally you would have brake fluid. Normally you would have brake fluid come out through that bleeder screw. You push that piston in. Once that is in, remove the tool, remove the pad. You would then go ahead and tighten this bleeder screw. Go ahead and take your pads. You want to go ahead and install these here. The inboard pad will have your squeak tab at the bottom, so that is positioned correctly. Work that into your slides. We'll go ahead and install our outboard pad here. And at this point here, you can go ahead and grab your brake caliper. You want to make sure that your sliders are positioned correctly. Put your caliper on. Install your upper bolt. Once that's got a couple threads, you can go ahead and line up the bottom. Get that installed. Let's go ahead and snug these down. So we had torque down our caliper bolts to 37 foot-pounds. Now at this point here, you want to go ahead and hop into the vehicle. You want to pump up the brakes. And then go underneath the hood, check your brake fluid level, make sure that the level is good. You should be good to go. Let's go ahead and install your wheel. So we're going to get our lug nuts all started by hand. Once these are on, we'll go ahead and snug them down. Let's go ahead and torque our lug nuts down to 80 foot-pounds.